Dit is alweer Vrydagmiddag, nie dat ek daaroor kla nie, die 9de Februarie. Ons gaan aan met Destiny. Ek het gister vir Wynand gevra hoekom hierdie boek in Engels geskryf is en toe het hy vir my gesê nadat hy The Long Lost Grave voltooi het in die gevangenis, het hy Destiny begin skryf en dit nooit voltooi nie. Hy het dit eers na sy gevangenskap jare later voltooi. En terwyl hy in die gevangenis was, mag hy nie in Afrikaans geskryf het nie, omdat die wagte nie Afrikaans verstaan het nie en hulle het alles gemonitor wat hy geskryf het. So daarom is dit in Engels. Goed, kom ons gaan aan. Tom took quite a few moments to recuperate, bringing his rasping breath under control as the four commando kayak lay side by side on the dark waters. "Everyone okay?" he asked at last, and the commando next to him injected a shot of morphine into his arm. There was immediate relief. Tom nodded as the team reported in whispers that everyone was fine and ready. The eastern horizon was already greying with the breaking dawn, and they had to reach the next rendezvous before daybreak. With trained expertise, they dipped the long oars in the water and started rowing downstream. One after the other, the kayaks sped away, following the one ahead. The pickup point was roughly 10 kilometers downstream. Grim-faced, the men rowed, oblivious of time and weariness, never missing a stroke, not giving an inch to the kayak ahead. Their camouflaged uniforms clung to the wetsuits, and each camouflaged, blackened face spoke of fierce determination as the team sped towards their rendezvous. If they were to miss it, it would simply mean another day in the stinking reeds on the riverbank. The thought was unbearable. At that moment, the breach blew. It seemed like the sky was torn apart and pieces of Derby shot up into the clear morning sky, catapulting into the dark waters of the Kunene River. The deafening sound of the explosion rolled away across the valleys and hills until only a deadly silence remained. The deafening Fapla and Cuban troops in the town of Zangongu stared in horror at the cloud of dust. Smoke hung over the destruction. 15 kilometers due east was the South African Military Command post under a large Mopani tree. The echo of the explosion reached them only a minute or two before confirmation was received that the vitally important bridge over the Kunene had been destroyed completely. A slow grin spread over the commanding officer's shaved face. They would attack at first light. The attack team, under command of Captain Tom McLachlan, grinned at each other victoriously. 15 minutes later, they approached the rendezvous, not forgetting the ambush earlier that morning. Tom led his men in close next to the reeds. Having made radio contact earlier on, he scanned the area ahead through the night vision binoculars. Then he saw the flashing infrared strobe that marked the landing. He prayed quietly. They had made it. That was all that Tom could remember. The South African Combat Group was deep in Angolan territory, driving the combined Cuban and Fapla forces back across the Kunene in one of the fiercest battles to date. Being cut off from the rest of their forces, the Cuban Fapla Brigade was trapped between the Kunene and the advancing South Africans. From their underground bunkers, they were putting up enormous resistance, knowing there was no escape. Already more than half of the brigade had been wiped out by the never-ending waves of bombers and artillery barrages. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. Already there were the reports of many deserters who vainly tried to cross the strong currents of the Kunene only to be cut to pieces by the South African artillery as the forward air controllers directed the airburst. Colonel Henny Lowe wiped the sweat from his dirt-streaked face where he stood erect through the turret of his Radl infantry combat vehicle, which served as his command post. 1,000 yards ahead of them was a burning, dense black smoke billowed up into the sky, and he saw vicious flashes of the airburst over the town of Zangongo. He saw the earth erupted as yet another Air Force strike commenced, and seconds later the defeating blast as the Mirage F-1 fighter bomber shot overhead. One after the other, the aircraft flew over the target, delivering its awful load of death and destruction with precision. The artillery was silent, allowing the airstrike a safe passage, but the gunners were working swiftly and with great speed. Traversed the G5 155mm guns to new targets to prevent any enemy interference, whilst the ground forces were clearing up Zangongo. Henny Lowe spoke into the mouthpiece of his combat radio to his various commanders awaiting the message. "Cobra," he commanded, at the last Mirage released its air-to-ground missiles. Ahead, the armed vehicles crashed through the undergrowth as the force moved in. Cannon and machine gun fire flew into the target area as the infantry prepared to step out. Sergeant Jimmy van der Merwe reset the fire selector on his R4 assault rifle as the rattle braked to a halt and the armored door swung open. He screamed as he dashed out and ran to the front of the rattle. Behind him, his stick. A stick is a team or a group of soldiers, mostly used by paratroopers. So his stick followed, and they fanned out to form an extended file in front of the combat vehicle. Jimmy dropped on his stomach, rifle ready in front of them, waiting for his men to be ready. From behind, the 20mm cannon of the rattle sent murderous bursts upon bursts of high explosive rounds into the already devastated target. For a brief moment, Jimmy stared at the scene in front of him. Tracers flew into the last stronghold of the depleted Cuban force, but the battlefield was deserted. Nowhere was any human movement, and for a moment, Jimmy thought he was going to be sick. The bomb-plowed killing area was covered with bodies, torn and ripped apart by the savage airburst projectiles. For a moment, it occurred to him that death on a battlefield was never gracious. Suddenly, dust flew up from a little mound on the ground 50 paces ahead of him. Instantly, Jimmy returned fire. It was incredible that there could be survivors after 2 days of heavy bombardment. Over his sights, Jimmy saw the rattle 20mm round searching towards the mound, hit it, covering it with dust and shrapnel. For the moment, the bunker was neutralized. Jimmy waved his men forward, and with his buddy firing away, he dashed 10 paces forward and dropped into a shell hole, firing at the target. "Move, Smithy, move!" he screamed, as his buddy was the last to dash forward. Along the front, the infantry advanced with fire and movement towards the broken line of almost lifeless trenches. Fierce yelling was heard along the line as the troops entered the Cuban trenches to wipe out the last few survivors. Jimmy reached the trench and dropped to one knee as the rest of his stick moved up to him. "Grenade!" Smithy yelled as he dropped the grenade into the trench. The explosion was dull against the background of machine gun fire, and Jimmy rolled over into the trench, emptying his magazine. As he did so, the trench was clear, except for the dead lying haphazardly. Behind him, the men followed into the trench. Taking the trench from leg to leg, they worked rapidly towards the bunker, where there was still enemy activity. From the bunker, they heard occasional gunfire as the covering fire of the Rattles was lifted. Jimmy paused against the sand wall of the trench. His few men huddled close to him. For a moment he felt the swell of pride in his chest. 2 days before they had blown the bridge over the Kunene that started this attack, and here they all were, always willing to give more than expected. He grinned and they smiled back at him. He read the readiness in their eyes. He gave the okay signal. They nodded and Jimmy went around the bend of the trench like a storming ram. The Cuban was lying in the opening to the bunker, awaiting them with the RPD machine gun on its bipod. He shot a full burst of 7.62mm rounds into Jimmy van der Merwe at short range. He saw the dust flying from the chest webbing as the bullets cut into the big South African. But he kept on firing as the sergeant fell, hitting the soldier behind him. Through the dust and blood, his target disappeared, but he held the trigger as he spun the RPD, seeking a new target, and vaguely saw the funny green ball flying at him. There was a vivid flash, and thousands of nails drove into him. I'm hit, he thought. I'm dying. Fiddle had promised. Ben de Lange saw Jimmy fell, and his right hand shot out and got a desperate grip of Smithy's webbing. With one forceful jerk, he yanked Smithy off his feet and back into the corner. At that same instant, he let go of the fly-off handle and hurled the hand grenade into the next leg of the trench. Let's go, he screamed as the grenade exploded. He jumped forward, half tripping over Jimmy. Even in the haze of the fighting, he could see the wide-open eyes of Jimmy staring unseeingly into the dust. Ben screamed with mad fury as he fought to his feet and shot into the dead Cuban. Go, Ben, go! He heard faintly as he crashed through the opening of the bunker, firing as he went. Something hit him low in the leg and he felt his knees giving in. Someone crashed into his back, sending him sprawling. There was chaos of wild firing and he heard Snake Basson's furious shouting, Bastards! Bastards! I'll kill you all, you communists! Then it was all over. A strange silence fell in the bunker and Ben lifted himself onto his knees, staring incredulously at his thigh. I'm bleeding, he mumbled. You bloody idiot, Snake snarled. You could have been killed. Why the hell did you storm in here? Jimmy is dead. Yes, I know. Snake's rage subsided just as the rest of the stick entered the bunker. Get Jimmy's radio. Where is Smithy? He was shot in the chest. Oh, this is war. Jeffrey, you go and help Smithy. Snake ordered as he pressed the handset of the radio. We have secured the bunker, he reported to the platoon commander in the Rattle. Stay put, was the curt reply, as the Rattle breached the trench further into the target. Colonel Henny Lowe jumped down from his command Rattle and walked to the edge of the cliff overlooking the torrent waters of the Kunene. It was done. Zangangu had fallen after 2 hectic days of constant fighting. Their victory was well earned. They had outmaneuvered the Cubans, outsmarted and outfought them. Behind him, all that was left of the once Cuban Fapla stronghold was the burning ruins of a former striving Portuguese community. A Puma helicopter flew from the south, its matted camouflage dark against the smoky sky, with the afternoon sun reflecting from the spotless perspex. It reared as it approached, speed rapidly dropping, its rotor blades chopping fiercely as it descended to the target. Henny stared as the medics rushed again towards the helicopter with the stretcher between them. He could see the bloodied figure lolling and one ordnance running next to the wounded soldier with a drip held high in one hand. Unlike previous loads of casualties, there was only one this time. He saw a dirty group of soldiers walking heavily under their packs towards the Puma's open doors. Curious, he observed that everyone of the stick was helping. "Captain," he asked his aide, "who is that?" "Rackies, Colonel or Colonel." They were the ones who cleared that difficult bunker. Lost their sergeant, one man wounded. Colonel Lowe nodded. "Is it the same team that had destroyed the bridge?" "Yes, sir. The captain was wounded during the operation." The aide was apprehensive. "They are a hell of a lot." As the Puma rose with its load of recce's, Colonel Lowe returned back to the river. "If it wasn't for the bridge, we would never have succeeded." He started at the derbies of the ruined bridge at the desolate defence bunkers on the far bank. "They've guts," he said, and turned to oversee the clear-up operation. Chapter 2. He first became aware of the cool hand on his forehead, then the soft voice calling his name. He opened his eyes. Everything was vague and swimming. He blinked his eyes. The face was fat and insubstantial. An angel, he thought, and closed his eyes again. "He's awake," he heard the voice again. He thought that it was beautiful, just like that of an angel. Then he felt the pain. It centered out from his shoulder, a dull, throbbing pain. He tried to move and it hurt right up into his chest. "Be quiet," the voice coaxed him. "You must rest." When he opened his eyes again, the face was gone. For many seconds he stared at the ceiling. It was very white and clean. He turned his head slowly and saw the plastic bags with fluid dangling above him. His eyes followed the thin plastic line down to his arm. A drip, he thought, and wondered how it had got there. "The bridge, the river!" He jerked upright and cried out as the pain hit him again. He fell back against the pillows. "Where the hell—" "Captain! Captain!" He heard a familiar voice, and this time he was wide awake. Staff Sergeant Ben de Lange was propped on one elbow in the next bed, a huge smile on his face. "We're in hospital. They got one hell of a doctor here." Tom McLachlan groaned. "What happened?" "You were wounded in the river 3 days ago." Everything came back to Tom. The destruction of the bridge, the river, the crocodile, and the exfiltration with the kayaks until they had been picked up shortly after first light. He remembered being treated by a field ordnance. Jimmy and the team had come to tell him that they were leaving to join the attacking force at Onjiva, and the exhausting flight aboard a Puma helicopter back to Oshikati. "Captain, here." Ben leaned over and placed a lit cigarette between his lips. They lay smoking for a few minutes. "And you?" Tom asked. "Got one in the leg. Superficial though," Ben added. "Smithy's gone to Pretoria this morning. Lung shot." Tom's head whipped around, his eyes suddenly sharp, questioning. "We hit a bad spot, had to clear a bunker. And the others?" Ben stared at him, suddenly uncertain of what to say. Tom read the answer on his friend's eyes. "Who?" he asked. "Jimmy." Tom slumped back to his pillows, fiercely sucking on the cigarette. "We took Zangongu," Ben said. "Too bloody small price for Jimmy's life," Tom Tom rasped, as he felt the first signs of tears in his eyes. Those bastards. And there was hatred in his voice. The next day, Tom felt much better. The medical ordinance moved the drip and grinned. The lieutenant kept you sedated for quite a while. She kept fussing over you. A woman? Tom sat upright. You have a female doctor here? The ordinance smiled secretively. Yes, sir, and I'd say she gave you super treatment. Damn. Tom cut him short. I hate those women doctors. Why didn't you stop her? He glared at Ben. Didn't know you hate female doctors. Anyway, you look pretty healthy this morning. To me you do. Seems she did a good job. Tom grumbled something about incompetence, grabbed a 5-day-old newspaper and buried his face in it. The doctor will be here soon. Tom ignored him and continued reading. The newspaper might be old, but to him it was fresh news. Still a little annoyed at Ben, he held the paper high and scanned through the headlines. Renewed outbreak of violence at crossroads in the Cape. Drought-stricken farmers suffered in the far northern Transvaal, and yet another Springbok rugby tour had been cancelled. He didn't notice the slim figure in the brown uniform entering the ward. She paused just inside the door. Morning, Ben, she smiled briefly at him, but her attention was with the patient who was now deeply interested in the old newspaper. She seemed hesitant, uncertain. Then, with a soft sigh, she crossed to Tom's bedside. I see your arm is out of the sling, she started, a little awkwardly. How the hell must I read a newspaper? Tom replied gruffly without looking up. Now the doctor smiled and pushed the paper down with one finger. Still the same old Tom McLaughlin? Tom lifted his eyes. Her eyes were the bluest blue he could remember. The blonde hair framing her face was neatly tied behind the head. The teeth showing when she smiled were even and very white. He saw the face of an angel. Tom stared. She smiled at him, almost fondly. He had never seen anything in the world as pretty as the deeply tanned and smooth skin on her face, glowing with pleasure. The few loose freckles were still there, as he remembered them. Leslie Ann, he whispered, astounded. You remember? Her voice trailed off. I was afraid that you wouldn't recognize me. For many more seconds he watched her face, unable to think of anything to say. You're a doctor? He asked. She nodded. I couldn't believe it was you when they carried you in here. I didn't know. It's been 8 years, he said softly, ever since your father left our farm. You were still a child. And you were an arrogant, selfish, spoiled, and marvelous matric boy. She smiled. Oh, that bad, huh? I hated you. And I hate women doctors. She leaned forward and kissed him on his lips. Welcome back, Tom. A soft whistle from Ben distracted them. Can I get one too? She shot him with a pretty smile. For a tiny little leg wound, ha! But the captain was only very lightly wounded in the arm. Now it is starting to look like a shot right through the heart. She laughed lightly. This patient's arm needs just a little attention, and that is just what we are going to do now. Hate women doctors. Ben shook his head. I must do that too. The base of the reconnaissance regiment was situated almost at the end of the runway. The dirt road leading to it was poor and dusty. Leslie Ann had to drive around some of the potholes. Her short wheelbase Land Rover bumped and rocked in the early morning sun as she kept the pedal against the floor. There was an angry tint on her cheeks as she barked as she braked to a stop in front of the closed gates. She was filled with a feeling of awe as she climbed out in front of the mysterious-looking base. High sandbanks surrounded the recce base, allowing none to be seen by anyone except a few allowed through the permanently locked and well-guarded gates. Shadow and camouflage nets obscured aerial observation, and visitors were allowed under escort and then only by invitation. Leslie Ann had never been here before, but she was well informed by her commanding officer about what to do. She had vainly tried to contact the Rackies by telephone, with no result. They obviously answered a phone whenever they feel like it. Under a dilapidated signboard that read Fort Fire, she took the handset of the field telephone that connected her with the guards inside. She had to ring a couple of times before it was picked up. "I want to speak to Captain McLaughlin," she told the guard on the other side. She waited 10 minutes before Tom appeared on the sand bank above her. Even in her anger, she couldn't help but notice the transformation he had undergone since the previous evening in the sick bay. 25 years of age, 6 feet 2 inches in his boots, he stood there with a boyish grin on his cleanly shaven face. He was sunburned to a dark tropical brown, and his maroon beret with the Compass Rose badge of the Special Forces sat a little askew on his head. She noticed the wide forehead, the dark eyes, and the neat moustache above the lips that smiled so easily. The uniform stretched a little around the wide shoulders, with the 3 stars of his rank on each shoulder. The parachute insignia and the Recce's operator's badge made an impressive view, and she couldn't help but experience a flare of admiration. Then she realized that his arm wasn't in a sling. She took a deep breath. "Captain, who discharged you from the hospital?" "Hi, Leslie, you came all the way to ask me that?" "You are supposed to stay there until I say so," she flared. "You aren't fit to be out yet." He grinned. "Oh, come on, Lieutenant, you don't expect Ben and me to stay here with these scratches?" "It isn't scratches, and you know it. What if infection—" "Leslie, one of my men died at Zangongu." He was suddenly reserved. "Smitty is in Pretoria with a chest wound. The men's morale is very low. They need me here." "You could have warned me." Tom shook his head. "You wouldn't have let me go. You're a doctor, a woman's doctor. Or a woman doctor." "Tom, it has nothing to do with that. Even though your arm is healing beautifully, it still needs dressing and antibiotics." "Our own medic can take care of that," he replied curtly. She could see that he wasn't going to change his mind. "Okay," she resigned, "but I insist on caring for it myself. I can't drive to Oshikati every day." Leslie Ann surrendered a smile. "I'll come out of here every day until I deem it fit, okay? I love to get away from the hospital every now and then." Tom felt his resentment crumbling as he watched her hopeful smile. "Good," he said. "I'll come down to fetch you at the gate." 10 minutes later, she had him seated on a chair in his bungalow. Under loud protest, she had made him take off his shirt, and she was now unwinding the field dressing. She worked swiftly, a vindictive smile on her face as she winced at her touch. There were traces of some renewed bleeding. "The wound is bleeding. You should have stayed at least 2 more days," she said as she turned to open her medical bag. "If the wound gets septic, it can cause you a lot of trouble." "Ah," Tom let out as she pressed it with a swab. "You're a sadist." "You were lucky," she continued, undisturbed. "The bullet entered your arm just above the elbow and split the flesh to the top of your shoulder. No bones were broken. I would say you were lying on your back." "Swimming," he helped her. Well, time for that in war, she mocked him, and she saw the shadow of secrecy in his eyes. Yeah, he replied dryly. How long have you been up there in the bush? She changed the subject and felt him relax under her hands. We're here most of the time, but this trip started in February. That's 8 months. We're going back home next week for Jimmy's funeral and perhaps stay for a week or two. Where are you stationed? She started with a fresh dressing. Langebaan. And will you see your parents? Tom sat quietly for a while. Probably. What about the farm? I always thought that you would go help your father. Tom sighed. Yeah, one day I will. It might be soon. Soon, she compelled the dressing and closed her bag. Tom stood up and put on his shirt. She turned to help, and he was awfully aware of her closeness. She smelled like fresh roses, and he stared into those blue eyes. There was a thickness in his throat, and he was aware of her beautiful mouth, slightly opened. He had been in the bush for so many months, never near a woman. Everything else was forgotten when he felt her arms slipping around his neck. He kissed her, hesitantly first, then more urgently, until they clung to each other hungrily. I've always loved you, she whispered. Brusquely, he pushed her away. I'm getting married in 3 months' time, he blurted out. Shocked, she stood there, and he was appalled by the hurt in her eyes. She choked and spun away from him. In one fluent movement, she grabbed her bag and fled through the door, leaving him behind, confused and miserable. Geniet jou naweek. Dankie dat jy die video's kyk, like, share en die bel button druk. Ek lees maandag weer verder aan Destiny.